So thanks for coming tonight, everybody. Um, I am going to talk about nature's best hope, or at least what my idea of nature's best hope is. And I'll give you a spoiler, you're nature's best hope. So what I'm really going to talk about is why I think you're nature's best hope. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what Edward O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He's the late Edward O. Wilson. He died the day after Christmas, almost 3 years ago. And we miss him a lot. One thing that was consistent throughout his very long career at Harvard was his love of life on Earth and his efforts to save it. He wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. And in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere, and that means humans too. It was a very bold statement, and he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save life on planet Earth. Well, of course, how could this be possible? Conservation biologists think it's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and everything that's in trouble can be in that half, and we humans will be in the other half, and it'll be great. But half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. And we've got 8.2 billion people in the other half, along with all of our roadways and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, I think we can. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. But in order to do that, we need a new approach to conservation. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happens when you have an oak mast. This is a big oak mast occurred in 2019. We had a couple since then. Members of particularly the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, and it forced its head through there. Then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And once the insect is out of the acorn, it's a very dangerous time for it because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And then once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And it surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole. It's kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. In this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, it's time to move the colony. Grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. And once they're inside, they post a little guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile, some people say 1.5 miles, from the parent tree. They tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold here. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants. And you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen that that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We've got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships. But the point I want to make tonight is that many, actually most of these relationships these days, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was, particularly the lower 48 states. There's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly, we have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it, got 770 million acres of rangeland out there. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because it is nature that sustains us on this planet. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just common sense. So you might wonder why we've done all this. I wonder why we've done it, and I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so big we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some scary headlines these days. Like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now, the UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they said that 3 years ago. So I guess it's the next 17 years now. It's a prediction, but it's one that we have to make sure does not come to pass, because these are the species that keep us alive on planet Earth. This is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappear, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if that happened, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse, and all those animals would disappear. We would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Good news is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do every day that we depend on every day, like produce oxygen, pretty important. Cleaner water, slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are capturing carbon, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. and through photosynthesis, turning it into food. They're building their tissues out of that carbon. Then they're pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root system. And once it's in the ground, it's extremely stable. Plants are building topsoil, holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. So if we lost our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight, and then we will lose weight. What are animals doing for plants? They're providing pest control services. They're pollinating nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They're dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8.2 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can. But it's not good enough, which is why we are now in the sixth great extinction event the planet has ever experienced. So I think the solution is to start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things, but he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it still remains in our own culture. He might not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. So where should we start? Well, private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And of course, failure is not an option. When I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do, of course, want to conserve any bits of nature that are out there. That has been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But it's not good enough. So now we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to rebuild nature in as many places as we possibly can. But there are those who will say, well, there's no way you're going to put it back exactly the way it was before we dismantle it. And they're probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions I opened the talk with to form ecosystem function once again. It may not be exactly what was on a particular space at some point in the past, but it still will function. And that's the goal, ecosystem function. But you're not going to build ecosystems unless you use the most important species, at least to begin with. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They're capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate those plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Turns out that caterpillars are enormously important. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. Dan Jansen calls them the bread and butter of terrestrial ecosystems, the meat and potatoes. We can't do without them. If we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that is at the feeder at my house all winter long. We've got the black-capped chickadee and chestnut-backed chickadee. There are chickadees all over the country. They're all pretty much the same bird doing the same thing. And one of the things they are doing in the wintertime is coming to our feeders and eating our seeds. And we tend to think that's all chickadees need. But even in the wintertime, only 50% of a chickadee's diet is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, to rear their young, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they move to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So why caterpillars? What is so special about caterpillars? Well, there's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have very sharp edges too. Then finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from, particularly during the breeding season? From all those prey items they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among those prey items. The first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more prey, far more carotenoids, I should say, than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. The moths and butterflies themselves, they have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm down here. So the earthworm gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Then a very interesting relationship between how often a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back more frequently than anything else, and they've got the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopteroids, which have the next highest carotenoid content. Then all those other types of prey have very low carotenoid contents, and they're not brought back very often at all. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? It's a good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one nest, one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce through to independence. And of course, after they're independent, they continue to eat caterpillars. It's a lot of caterpillars. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places that's all we have is our yards, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. That's true for most birds. They forage very close to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not create all those caterpillars. That's called insect decline, and it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. We divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the species that require insects when they're breeding and the species that do not require insects when they're breeding. So this group is the doves and the finches and the crossbills, a few others. They actually can make a little seed or a little milk out of the seeds that they eat, and that's what they rear their young on. And look, those birds didn't decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects decline on average 10 million individuals per species. Now, that doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you are, as we're taking away bird food, we're losing the birds. So I think we've got to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing: be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do two things: be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. That's the new horticultural challenge. But they're not going to be ecologically functional if we don't put caterpillars back in our landscape. So how do you do that? Well, you do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars into our landscapes. And that seems pretty easy, pretty straightforward. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which ones we include in our yards, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the burning bush and all the buckthorn and all the crepe myrtle and all the ginkgos and all the hostas and all the privets, all the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is its host plant, one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants they have co-evolved with. Why is that? Remember, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well defended. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants for which they have specialized adaptations, specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify the defensive chemicals, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those chemicals. But all those adaptations take a long time to develop. So the insects have to share a coevolutionary history with their host plant. And once those adaptations fall into place, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to make a living on hostas. Can't do it. It's locked into milkweed. So the only option it has then is fly away and find milkweed someplace else or starve to death. Turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a detractor would be any of the invasive ornamentals that we have from Asia. This is Callery pear or Bradford pear. That not only are not contributing much energy, but they escape into our natural areas and push out the contributing native plants that run our food webs. We've measured caterpillar communities in invasive communities like this, and they're reduced by 96%. So if you think of caterpillars as bird food, when you have an invasion like this, it's a 96% reduction in bird food. No wonder our birds are in trouble. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We cannot rebuild ecosystem function. We cannot restore those parts of nature if we don't have functional food webs in those ecosystems. And you're not going to have functional food webs unless you use the plants that create those food webs. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house where Cindy and I live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. It was part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. We got one of those lots. And it was a very old farm, been farmed for almost 300 years. The last thing I did was mow it for hay, so there was not much there. And we wanted to restore this landscape, which we had never done before. We didn't know what we were doing. But one of the things I wanted to try was to plant one of plant a host plant of a particular caterpillar and see whether that moth actually came and colonized that host plant. And the first one I chose was a Canadian owlet. I've never even seen a Canadian owlet before. This is what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have its host plant, meadow row. We didn't have any meadow row. I'm sure it was there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death, but the meadow row was long gone. So I got some seeds from someplace and I planted them and it grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and colonize my little patch of meadow row. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. Maybe it was 3 months. And I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over it. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow row and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to that depauperate ecosystem. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there was some Biden's in a power line cut about 14 miles from our house. So I got some seeds. I planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last summer they took over my front yard. That's okay. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of goldenrod or Biden's, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. I want to see if the hackberry emperor could make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be occupying our space. But as its name suggests, it requires hackberry, celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I planted a couple trees. We had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find our hackberry, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. We've added 6 species to the property. That's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear some people don't like it, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to fuel that migration, and our overwintering birds need sources of fat to get them through the winter. And these berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know Virginia creepers in bloom until you see a big cloud of native bees around those flowers. Turns out that Virginia creeper is a wonderful pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths, the large caterpillars that are an important component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. I want to see if the double-toothed prominent could make a living at our house. Just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. It looks like a stegosaurus. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm, and we didn't have any American elm. We lost it decades ago to the Dutch elm disease. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die, and every year they drop a lot of seed. So I gathered up some of that seed from the gutter, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days. They grew very quickly. So today those trees are over 80 feet tall. And yes, they attracted the double-toothed prominent. Another big success, American elm. Want to see if I could get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, and of course it depends on that, so I planted it. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Well, these are just examples of the lineages we put back on our property, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns or as 2-foot bare root which cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that make the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is an important point. Here is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of this tree. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to your local food web. It will do it the very first year. It's what our property looks like today, taken from the same place I took that first picture. Just to give you an idea, we put some of the plants back. Not all of them, we're still working on it, but the question is, have the plants we put back on our property brought life back to the property? Has life returned? Now, you can measure that in lots of different ways. I'm measuring it in the number of breeding birds that we've recorded on our property and the number of moth species that I've recorded. I've been taking pictures of every species of moth that I could find on our property for the last 8 years. Moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are just bad-tasting, day-flying moths, which is why they can fly during the day because they don't taste very good, which means they're not adding a lot to local food webs. So we focus on moths, the bread and butter of those food webs. I'm still at it, but I am up to 1,337 species of moths that are now making a living at our house because we put the plants back. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania's, it's either 22.9 million acres or 29.2 million acres. I can't remember. But the point is, just a tiny slice of Pennsylvania, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why are they bred there? Because we've got the bird food that allows them to do that. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn statistics like this around. But will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? That's an excellent question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved in, their yard was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another serious invasive from Asia. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then they sat back and started to count the birds using their yard. And they are up to 154 bird species, including 35 warbler species that have used their yard. That's an incredible number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 18 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago, and I mean in Chicago. Her property abuts O'Hare Airport. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. She is a little teeny island in the middle of Chicago. But Pam is a native plant landscaper. So she's landscaped the entire property with native plants except for her little patch of lawn here. Put in 60 species of native plants, took out the non-natives that were on her property, added a little water feature, and then she started to count the birds that are using her yard. She says, sat back with a glass of wine and started to count them. And she's still at it, but she's up to 127 bird species that have used her yard so far, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we want to succeed in a big way. And one of those is we've got to address those big lawns. We've got more than 44 million acres of lawn nationwide, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. That's an area bigger than all of New England combined. Why do we do this? Well, it's a status symbol. Lawn is a status symbol. We like neat. It's easy to keep lawn neat. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. But look, there are 4 things every property has to, 4 ecological goals that every property has to have. Every property has to support a food web, or you're not going to have a functional ecosystem. Every property has to sequester carbon to help climate change. Every property has to manage the watershed in which it lies. And every property has to support pollinators, not for agriculture, but because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it. So let's reduce the area of lawn. Let's cut it in half, as a matter of fact. Let's take areas that look like this and turn them into this. Now, this is a planning in progress. I got this picture from Dan Getman, who lives in Missouri. He's had this giant lawn here, and he's putting plants back. And he wanted me to see how he was doing. Well, let's cut the area of lawn in half. Let's make the math simple. Say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. That will give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is enough land to make what we're calling homegrown national park. And it will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. If you add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So homegrown national park will be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? Some part of nature right at home. We get the opportunity to interact with it at our own time, our own pace. All we have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out a window. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people there last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic or government closure comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is really, really important. You're trying to rebuild or build for the first time a personal, unique relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And this is particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour. They walk around a natural area for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. And they get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right in their yard, all they have to do is go out and get to know it, become familiar with it, fall in love with it. Alone, no parental supervision. When we hover over our kids, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should fear. Our kids are fearful enough now, believe me. It's a terrible message to be sending to the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what good stewardship is, if they're afraid to be a good steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Maybe they're going to learn how to hunt lizards. Learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a piece of grass with a hedge, but there are no lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt those lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks, and you crawl slowly towards the lizard. Leaves and sticks so the lizard can't see you coming. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. You fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember these very modest interactions with nature the rest of her life, and I guarantee she's going to be a good steward because of it. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. We are real now, a small nonprofit. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the biodiversity map. You can do it whether you live in Canada or the US. What you're doing is you're going to put your location in the database and the amount of your property that you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the area of lawn. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It doesn't matter how modest it is. You're making a pledge to good stewardship of your property. And once you've entered that data into the database, your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And you get to see who else or how many other people in your county have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course, the goal is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people, millions and millions and millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity, using native plants. By removing the non-native invasive plants that do not support biodiversity, and in doing so, build a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is a significant increase in biodiversity. And when I see what's happened at our house, I see that it works. Nature is really resilient. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody got rid of the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 78% done in the country. We'd be 85% done in the East. That's a really good first step. Significant drawdown in atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the very worst plant for sequestering carbon. So if you replace it with any other kind of planting, you're going to sequester more carbon and help climate change. And you're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of the park. There are also important sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and national awareness is one of them, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We're trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not there just for our entertainment. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, which means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge existing conservation organizations like Audubon or National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all of the land conservancies that are out there. We want to merge them all onto one visual, the biodiversity map, so we can see how we're doing. There's a lot of good conservation happening on private property, and nobody is recording it. It'll also show us where there are gaps. It'll also help us to see how we're going towards the national goal of saving 30% of the country by 2030. That's not going to happen if we don't record conservation on private property. Did I mention Homegrown National Park is free? It doesn't cost you anything to do this. We don't charge because we don't want to pull people away from other conservation organizations. We're not competing with them. We're all on the same page. We just want to record the good conservation that's happening on private property. So we're going to reduce the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? Well, I'm going to argue that some of them should be what we call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. This 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars out there that drive our food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're essential. They're the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. Oaks are the number one keystone plant in 84% of the counties in which they occur. They support 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states and over 950 species nationwide. Again, no other plant genus comes close to that. If you want to know what the very best plants are where you live, go to Native Plant Finder in the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. This abbreviated list because I ran out of room. But the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is just an excuse now. We do know what to plant. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our property, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. It turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, and these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects every night. It's actually good news to me because there's a really simple solution. Turn your lights out. A lot of lights to turn out there, but there's a lot of us to flick those switches. And I know you're going to say, well, I can't turn my light out because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on that security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And if you don't want to do that, even easier is to take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. It's an extremely important environmental issue with a very, very simple solution. So if we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. This is the booming business around the country, unfortunately. And they say it's okay because what we're fogging is an organic, natural product that only kills mosquitoes. Organic means it's produced by plants. They're fogging pyrethroids, which is a product made by chrysanthemums. This is industrial strength pyrethroids. Natural, yeah, natural. But, cyanide is an organic, natural product as well. Ricin is a natural organic product. So I don't think that means it's safe. They also say it only kills mosquitoes, not even close to true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including our beleaguered monarchs, which we've now lost over 96% of. This is a result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake. A few years ago, my friend happened to be there, and he picked up a handful of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. This was the middle of a big migration. It's killing all the pollinators. The interesting thing is it's not controlling mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% to get good control in the adult stage. And these guys kill between 10 and 50%. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And you can do it with mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or leaves, dead leaves, some organic matter, put it out in the sun for a couple of days. You're building up the population of diatoms and algae in your bucket, and that's what mosquito larvae eat. So this becomes an irresistible brew to any female mosquito in your yard. She will lay her eggs preferentially in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks, $12 for a season worth of control. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera, and the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's targeted, it's cheap, and if everybody did it, it would work. This works too. Just get a fan, put it on your picnic table, plug it in. You can have your cocktail there in the afternoon. Sit in the directed breeze. Mosquitoes won't fly into it. You don't have to kill anything. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to design landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. And I'm specifically talking about the landscape under our trees. Now, this is just an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94% of them grow as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle beneath the soil and pupate under soil, under the ground. Or They spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the areas under our trees so that they're rock hard, making it very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground. This becomes an ecological trap. These are oaks. They're calling on moths to lay their eggs. The caterpillars develop, drop down, and die. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You have a tree in your yard. I have a grad student just finishing up now, Emma Jonas, who has been measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape. Soft landing is what Heather Holm calls it. The caterpillars drop down. The important feature here is not the plants that are under your tree. It's the fact that the soil is not compacted and it's a no-go zone. Nobody's walking in there. Nobody's squishing the pupae. When they go underground, they're right under the surface there, and they're very easy to squish with a mower or your feet. So that creates a safe zone, much higher survivorship for the caterpillars. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put beds around the trees. The bigger, the better. Your tree will love it, and so will those caterpillars. Use the native ground covers that we have. We've got wild ginger. There's a native pachysandra. This is Virginia creeper ground cover I talked about. Golden seal, mayapple, foam flower ferns. There's lots of options here. If you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants. That's green mulch. Again, your tree will love it, and so will the caterpillars. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. And compromise, good thing. She had one simple question. How well do chickadee populations do in suburban yards that are dominated by native landscapes, native plants, compared to yards dominated by introduced ornamentals? Now, everybody had nest boxes up in their yard. Little senior moment there. So chickadees had an opportunity to breed in these suburban yards inside the Beltway. The first thing that Desiree found is that when the yards are dominated by non-native plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees in their yard at all. So the chickadees would come to that nest box and look around and say, well, there's not enough to eat here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We look at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. The dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which you have to make babies in the population to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, anything above the line here, and that's what happens when you have very few non-native plants, then you have a growing population. But if you're below the dotted line, and that's what happens when you have a lot of non-native plants, then you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. More adults are dying each year than babies that are replacing them. Now, right here, liberally speaking, is where those lines intersect. And it suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying your local food web. This is the area of compromise. So you can have some non-native plants in your yard, and that without destroying the food web, as long as they're not invasive. We can't tolerate invasive plants because they're ecological tumors. They just keep growing and growing and growing. But there are a lot of ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman's property? This is a ginkgo tree. Why does Dan have a ginkgo from Asia in his native planting? Well, it turns out that Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and Dan likes his wife, so he put the ginkgo in. But the real question is this ginkgo tree destroying the ecological productivity of this yard? No, it's just there. Is it going to escape and wreck the woodlot? No, they're not invasive. They don't move around. It's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just occupying space as if they're decorative statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If all of Dan's plants were statues, he would not have a productive landscape. But it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys those food webs. It's the absence of the native plants that support them. Put in a lot more of those high contributing plants, and you can tolerate these. Can we use native plants in formal landscapes? Yes, we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. This was taken by a drone 400 feet up, and every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Sure we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of native bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media tells you it's because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 12th of our crops. And I hear people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere, because they're pollinating, again, 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. How about this? Drew Latham design. It's much bigger. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life over here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's been doing it for several years now. It's got a cost-sharing program that is helping homeowners reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very, very popular. Pennsylvania's got a similar program. Virginia's starting one. It's starting. This idea is spreading. Good news. There's an island off of Florida, I think it's Marco Island, that is paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what St. Louis, Missouri did. Fayetteville, Arkansas, North Carolina. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to put in water-efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west, particularly California. This has gone up now. You get $3 rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. California does not have enough water for lawn. If you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. It's not that we don't like it. We like nature. We like to go bird watching and ride our bikes and just take a walk, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. They're beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it's much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about that, but if we restrict conservation efforts just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small, too isolated, and there's too few of them. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between isolated habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places where we've destroyed them. The good news is this is starting to happen. It is really starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans actually have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't we all share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Robert Swan once said, "The greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it." Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, "The Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations." You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. It does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are recognizing that the earth has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can use keystone plants. One person can put in a pollinator garden. One person can remove the invasives on their property. One person can change their light bulbs. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can do a whole bunch of things to really invigorate the ecosystem on their property and then enhance their greater local ecosystem instead of continuing to destroy it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this, turn them into that. And whether or not we decide to do that is going to determine the future of nature. It's going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.